The heavy brass deadbolt clicked. It was a small sound, barely louder than the hum of the office air conditioner, but in the dead silence of the executive suite, it echoed like a gunshot. Charlie stared at the closed door, then turned slowly back to the mahogany desk. Her 2-week notice sat exactly where she'd placed it, crisp, white, and completely ignored. Donegan slid the brass key into his tailored suit pocket. He didn't yell. He just looked at her. "You're staying." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor always made Charlie's ears pop. Usually, she swallowed hard, adjusted her blazer, and let the sudden shift in cabin pressure ground her before stepping into the lion's den. Today, she barely noticed the altitude. Her thumb rhythmically stroked the edge of a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 paragraphs, standard corporate boilerplate. "Thank you for the opportunity. Effective 14 days from this date. Wishing Romero Logistics continued success." It was a lie, of course. All of it. She didn't want to thank Donegan Romero. She didn't want to wait 14 days. And she certainly didn't wish his company, a sprawling, blood-soaked money laundering operation thinly veiled as a transatlantic shipping empire, any success. She just wanted out. The elevator doors chimed and slid apart, revealing the expansive, slate-gray reception area of the executive tier. Charlie stepped out. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished Italian marble. "Morning, Charlie," the receptionist, a young woman who was paid far too much to ask far too few questions, offered a bright smile. "Morning, Jess. Is he in?" "Since 6 a.m. Trevon is in there with him right now, but they should be wrapping up." Charlie nodded, her grip on the envelope tightening until the paper threatened to bend. Trevon Shaw, Donegan's head of security. Whenever Trevon was in the office before sunrise, it meant a shipment had gone wrong, or someone had talked to the wrong federal agent. Charlie didn't want to know. For 3 years, she had survived by looking strictly at the numbers, ignoring the glaring discrepancies in the warehouse manifests, and pretending she was just a senior financial analyst. But yesterday changed things. Yesterday, she had found a secondary ledger hidden in a secure server directory. It wasn't just shipping discrepancies anymore. The ledger mapped out a string of shell companies tied directly to a local district attorney's sudden influx of offshore wealth, and a subsequent, very violent warehouse fire. The blood was no longer abstract. It was in the spreadsheets. Charlie approached the heavy oak double doors of Donegan's office. Before she could knock, the right door swung open. Trevon walked out. He was a large man, built like a freight train, with a perpetually broken nose and eyes that missed nothing. He stopped, looking down at Charlie. "Charlie," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He glanced at her hand, noticing the white envelope. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed a fraction of an inch. "He's in a mood." "When isn't he?" Charlie replied, keeping her voice level. Trevon let out a short, breathy chuckle. "Fair point. Good luck." He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Charlie walked in. The office was cavernous, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. The sky outside was a heavy, bruised purple, threatening rain. Raindrops had already begun to streak the glass, distorting the world below. Behind an expansive, custom-built desk of dark mahogany sat Donegan Romero. He didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. He was dressed impeccably, as always. A charcoal 3-piece suit, the jacket draped over the back of his chair, leaving him in his vest and rolled-up shirt sleeves. He had the kind of sharp, angular features that looked like they belonged on a Roman coin, but there was a permanent, cynical edge to his mouth that ruined any classical beauty. He was 34, running an empire built by violent men, and he looked entirely bored by the prospect. "I told Trevon to handle the Port Authority," Donahan said, his voice smooth, carrying an undertone of casual authority. He still hadn't looked up. "If they want higher bribes, they need to offer faster clearance. We aren't running a charity." "It's me, Donegan," Charlie said. He finally raised his head. His eyes, a striking cold amber, locked onto hers. The shift in his demeanor was immediate. The board executive vanished. The predator took his place. He sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Charlie." The way he said her name always felt too familiar, too intimate. "You're off schedule. We don't have our financial review until Thursday." "This isn't about the quarterly review." She walked toward the desk. Every step felt like walking through wet cement. She had practiced this speech in her bathroom mirror a dozen times last night, but under his unblinking stare, the words evaporated. She chose the coward's route. She didn't speak. She just reached the edge of the desk, extended her arm, and placed the crisp white envelope precisely in the center of his blotter. Donegan looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. "What is this?" he asked softly. "It's my resignation," Charlie said. Her voice shook, just a fraction, and she hated herself for it. 2 weeks' notice, as per my contract." The silence in the room suddenly felt physical, like a weight pressing against her chest. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner grew deafening. Donahan leaned forward slowly. He picked up the envelope by the corner, inspecting it as if it were a strange, dead insect. He didn't open it. He simply looked at the closed seal, then back up to Charlie. "Your resignation," he repeated. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. "Yes. No. Donahan, I'm giving you my notice. I've already typed up transition documents for my junior associates. The accounts are perfectly balanced. You won't lose a single cent during the handover." He dropped the envelope back onto the desk. He stood up. He wasn't a massive man like Trevon, but he possessed a coiled, kinetic energy that commanded every square inch of the room. He walked around the desk, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "I didn't ask about the transition documents, Charlie," he said, walking past her. Charlie turned to watch him. He walked straight to the heavy oak door she had just entered through. He grabbed the brass handles, pulled them shut with a heavy, final thud. Then he reached into his vest pocket, withdrew a small, intricate brass key, and slid it into the lock beneath the handle. Click. The heavy brass deadbolt slid into place. Donahan pocketed the key, turned his back to the door, and looked at her. "You're staying." "Open the door, Donahan," Charlie said. The demand lacked the steel she intended. It sounded more like a plea. Donegan didn't move from the door. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back against the polished wood. "Sit down, Charlie." "I am not sitting down. I am resigning. You can't just lock me in here." "I just did." He tilted his head, watching her with a detached, clinical interest. "You're shaking." "I'm angry," she shot back, her nails biting into her palms. "This is a corporate office, not one of your back alley warehouses. You don't get to hold me hostage because you don't like my paperwork." Donahan's jaw tightened. The mention of the warehouses was a slip, a crack in the carefully maintained wall between her legitimate job and his actual business. He pushed off the door and began to close the distance between them. "Is that what this is?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "You think you're in danger here? You think I'm holding you hostage?" "What else do you call locking the door?" she countered, taking a step back until her hips hit the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. She was trapped between him and the furniture. He stopped a few feet away. The scent of him, rich espresso and something metallic, like rain on hot asphalt, washed over her. "I call it forcing a conversation you are clearly trying to run away from. 2 weeks' notice? A formal envelope? After 3 years, you walk in here like a stranger and hand me a piece of paper? It's professional. It's an insult," he snapped. The sudden burst of anger made Charlie flinch. Donegan noticed. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, exhaling a long breath to rein himself in. When he opened them, the cold control was back. "Why are you leaving, Charlie?" "I found a better opportunity, better hours, better benefits." He laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound entirely devoid of humor. "Don't insult my intelligence. I pay you double the market rate. I gave you your own department. I let you set your own hours." "You own my life," she exploded, the frustration finally boiling over. "I don't have a life outside of this building, Donegan. I work 80-hour weeks. My phone rings at 3 in the morning, and I have to answer it, because if I don't, I know Trevon will show up at my apartment." "Has Trevon ever hurt you?" Donegan asked softly. "No, but he stands in my living room bleeding on my carpet while you ask me to route $3 million through a Cayman shell before the sun comes up." "That isn't normal accounting, Donahan. I am exhausted. I am paranoid. Every time I see a police cruiser behind me on the drive home, my stomach drops. I'm done." Donegan stared at her. He didn't deny the reality of her words. He couldn't. They both knew exactly what she did for him. She was the architect of his financial invulnerability. Without her, his empire was just a pile of dirty cash waiting to be seized. "You knew what this was when you took the promotion last year," he stated flatly. "I knew it was gray. I didn't know it was pitch black," Charlie fired back. "I saw the secondary ledger yesterday, Donahan, the DA's accounts, the warehouse fire." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Charlie instantly regretted saying it. The cardinal rule of surviving the Romero family was ignorance. By admitting she had seen the secondary ledger, she had just upgraded herself from a resigning employee to a massive legal liability. Donahan didn't look angry. If anything, he looked incredibly weary. He reached up, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You weren't supposed to see that server," he muttered. "I'm the lead auditor. I look at everything. It's my job." "It was a mistake," he said, dropping his hand and meeting her eyes. "The fire wasn't supposed to happen. It got out of hand. The money to the DA was containment." "I don't care," Charlie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't want to know the mechanics of it. I just want out. Let me walk out that door. I'll sign an NDA. I'll sign a blood oath. Whatever you people do. Just let me go." Donegan took a slow step forward, cutting off her only avenue of escape. He was now standing inches from her. She had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "You think an NDA protects me from the FBI, Charlie?" he asked softly. "I wouldn't talk. You know I wouldn't." "I know." He reached out. Charlie stiffened, expecting him to grab her arm, but instead, his fingers lightly brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violent context of their conversation. I know you wouldn't betray me. That's not why I locked the door. Charlie swallowed hard, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Then why? Donahan leaned down, his face inches from hers. Because last Wednesday, you took a long lunch. You went to a steakhouse in Midtown. You sat across from a man in a cheap gray suit for 2 hours. Charlie's eyes widened. You had me followed? I have you protected, he corrected smoothly. But my guys gave me a report. They took pictures. You were smiling at him. It was a job interview, Charlie yelled, shoving at his chest. He didn't budge. He's an HR director for a logistics firm in Seattle. I know who he is, Donahan said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. And I know he kept touching your hand across the table. I know he offered you a relocation package. You were planning to move to Seattle. With him. It was a networking lunch, Donahan. And yes, it was an interview. Because I am trying to leave this nightmare. You're not going to Seattle, Donahan stated, his eyes blazing with a sudden, naked possessiveness that made Charlie's breath hitch. You're not taking meetings with HR directors who buy cheap suits and try to touch what isn't theirs. You aren't leaving this company, and you certainly aren't leaving me. The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the air. What isn't theirs? Charlie felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, a toxic mixture of profound anger and a deeply buried, humiliating thrill. She hated that she felt it. She hated that for 3 years she had buried her attraction to a man who represented everything destructive in the world. I don't belong to you, she said. The words were meant to be sharp, but they came out breathless. Donegan stepped even closer, pressing into her space. His hands came up, gripping the edge of the desk on either side of her hips, caging her completely. Don't you? He asked quietly. Who signs your checks, Charlie? Who cleared your mother's medical debt 2 years ago when the insurance company denied the claim? That was a bonus. I earned that. I bought the hospital's debt collection agency and erased the file. He corrected effortlessly, stating a fact he had kept hidden for 24 months. Charlie froze. The air left her lungs. What? I bought the agency, he repeated, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. Because you were stressed. You were making mistakes in the ledgers. You were crying in your car before coming up to the office. I couldn't have that. You bought a company to cancel my debt. She stared at him, the cynical reality of his power crashing over her. He hadn't just given her a bonus. He had manipulated the very fabric of her life behind the scenes, playing God with her problems so she could focus on cleaning his dirty money. It was efficient, he said, as if discussing a stock trade. It's psychotic, she whispered. It's taking care of what's mine. Stop saying that! I am an employee! She pushed against his shoulders again, harder this time. She needed distance. She needed to breathe. But Donahan simply absorbed the push, his hands remaining firmly planted on the desk. You haven't been just an employee for a long time, Charlie, and we both know it, Donegan said, his facade of cold professionalism finally fracturing. The anger in his amber eyes was shifting into something far more dangerous, far more desperate. You sit in this room with me for 10 hours a day. You know how my mind works better than I do. You know the exact cost of every lie I tell. You are the only person in my entire God-forsaken life who sees the monster and doesn't run. I'm trying to run right now. But you waited 3 years to do it, he countered, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched. You saw the blood on the ledgers a long time ago, Charlie. Don't lie to me. You justified it. You rationalized it. Because you liked the power. You liked sitting in the tall tower, moving millions of dollars with a keystroke. And, his voice dropped to a ragged whisper, you liked being with me. Charlie closed her eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to call him a liar. But the words died in her throat. She remembered the late nights in this office, eating takeout on the floor over scattered tax documents. She remembered the rare moments he smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made him look like a normal man instead of a mafia prince. She had stayed because the danger was intoxicating, and because the man wielding it had made her feel indispensable. It has to stop, Donahan, she whispered, keeping her eyes closed. If I stay, I'll end up in a federal prison. Or worse. I'll end up like you. I won't let anyone touch you, not the feds, not my enemies. You can't guarantee that. I can, he stated with absolute certainty. I will burn the entire city to the ground before I let anyone put a hand on you. He shifted his weight, releasing his grip on the desk to bring his hands up to her face. His thumbs gently traced the line of her jaw. The contrast between the violence of his words and the tenderness of his touch was completely disorienting. Charlie opened her eyes. The space between them had vanished. She could feel his breath on her lips. Stay, he murmured, no longer an order, but a heavy, desperate demand. Throw that letter in the trash. Tell the guy in Seattle to go to hell. Stay with me. He tilted his head, his lips grazing hers. It wasn't quite a kiss. It was a question, a test of her resolve. A jolt of electricity shot down Charlie's spine. Her hands, which had been pushing against his chest, slowly curled into the fabric of his vest. She hated herself. She hated him. And yet, she leaned into the touch, surrendering to the gravitational pull she had fought for 3 years. Just as Donegan's arm wrapped around her waist to pull her flush against him, a heavy rhythmic pounding echoed against the locked doors. Knock, knock, knock. They both froze. The spell shattered. Boss, Trevin's muffled, gravelly voice bled through the heavy oak. We have a problem. The Port Authority just seized container 42. They're demanding to speak with you. Donegan squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a frustrated, ragged sigh. His forehead rested against Charlie's for 1 second longer before he slowly pulled back. The Mafia boss returned, slipping over his features like a cold iron mask. He looked down at her. Her lips were parted, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He reached behind her, picked up the white envelope containing her resignation, and tore it neatly in half. Then in quarters, he let the pieces fall into the metal trash can beside the desk. We're not done with this, he said quietly, stepping back and straightening his vest. Charlie watched him walk to the door. She didn't argue. She didn't try to draft another letter. As the brass lock clicked open and the chaotic, violent reality of Donegan's world spilled back into the room with Trevin's entrance, Charlie realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't going to Seattle. The silence in the office was heavier now that Donegan was gone. Charlie stood by the mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on the metal trash can. Inside lay the torn, jagged quarters of her resignation. It was just paper. She could print another one. She could walk to the elevator, press the button for the lobby, and never come back. She didn't move toward the door. Instead, she smoothed the front of her blazer, took a shallow breath that tasted like ozone and stale coffee, and walked out into the bullpen. The outer office was usually a quiet hive of keystrokes and hushed phone calls. Now, it was electric with panicked energy. Junior analysts were standing at their desks, whispering. Trevon stood over the receptionist's monitor, his massive frame blocking the screen, while Donahan paced the length of the frosted glass conference room. Charlie pushed through the glass door. Donahan stopped pacing. Trevon looked up. "Container 42, Charlie said, her voice flat, professional. The tremor from the locked room was gone, buried under years of corporate conditioning. "That's the medical supply front, the one masking the bearer bonds for Miller." Trevon grimaced. "She's not cleared for this, boss. She knows more about the underlying corporate structure than you do, Trevon," Donegan replied, without looking away from Charlie. He gestured to the tablet on the conference table. Port Authority Chief flagged it for a random manual inspection. They've locked it in a holding pen. If they crack the seal, they find $30 million in unregistered bonds wrapped inside MRI machine casings. Charlie walked to the table. She swiped the tablet screen, pulling up the customs de Charlesian form. Her mind slipped into the familiar, cold logic of numbers and regulations. It was easier here. In the spreadsheets, there was no breath against her skin. There were no locked doors. "Who ordered the inspection?" she asked. "Some mid-level supervisor trying to make a quota," Trevon grunted. "I have 2 guys on the way to his house to explain the situation to his wife." "No," Charlie said sharply. Trevon blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being countermanded by the accounting department. He looked at Donegan. Donegan simply crossed his arms, watching Charlie with a terrifyingly proud intensity. "Call them off," Charlie instructed, scrolling through the customs codes. "If you intimidate a mid-level supervisor, he might back down, but he'll file a distressed incident report. The FBI sweeps those reports monthly. You'll invite a federal audit by next quarter." "So we just let them open the box?" Trevon asked, his tone dripping with heavy skepticism. "No," Charlie tapped a line on the manifest. "We reclassify the shipment. Right now, it's coded as Class 2 Medical Tech. Standard inspection protocol. Change the manifest in the central database to Class 9 Hazardous Radiological Materials." Trevon frowned. "The bonds aren't radioactive." "They don't have to be," Charlie explained, looking up. "The moment the port system registers a Class 9 radiological hazard on a container lacking the proper containment seals, the local port authority loses jurisdiction. It triggers an automatic handover to the Department of Energy's Hazard Response Team. The DOE takes 3 days to deploy a specialized unit to a commercial port." Donahan stepped closer to the table. He understood exactly what she was building. "3 days," he murmured. "3 days," Charlie confirmed, her eyes locking onto his. "During which the container sits in a quarantine zone. No manual inspections. No port officials allowed within 50 yards. Tomorrow night, you have your warehouse crew slip into the quarantine zone, swap the bonds for actual lead-lined MRI casings, and reseal the box. When the DOE finally shows up, they find a harmless medical shipment with a clerical error on the paperwork." Silence stretched across the conference room. Trevon looked from the tablet to Charlie, a slow, grudging respect settling into his battered features. "I'll make the database edit," Trevon said quietly. He grabbed the tablet and walked out of the room, closing the glass door firmly behind him. Charlie and Donegan were alone again. Donahan didn't say a word. He walked slowly around the edge of the conference table, until he was standing right beside her. He looked down at the empty space where the tablet had been, then shifted his gaze to her face. "You're brilliant," he said. The gravel in his voice scraped along her nerves. "It's a temporary fix. It buys you time, nothing more. It saves my operation," he corrected. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the sleeve of her blazer. "You saved my operation. I did it so Trevin wouldn't threaten a man's wife, Donahan, not for you. Lie to yourself if it helps," he whispered, stepping into her personal space. The scent of espresso and rain returned, intoxicating and dangerous. "But out there, in front of my men, you didn't look like an accountant trying to quit. You looked like the woman who runs this family." Charlie swallowed hard, stepping back. The glass wall of the conference room pressed against her shoulder blades. There was nowhere to retreat. "I don't want to run your family. I just want to survive it." Donegan's expression hardened, the possessive fire reigniting in his amber eyes. "You will do both. Tonight, District Attorney Miller is hosting a charity gala at the Pierre Hotel. He expects the first installment of the bonds. Since the physical bonds are currently in a radioactive quarantine because of your very clever maneuver, we need to offer him a digital alternative. A wire transfer is traceable, not if you route it through the Cayman shell accounts you established last month," Donegan said smoothly. "You want me to execute a $3 million bribe from a hotel ballroom?" "I want you on my arm while you do it," he replied. He reached out, his hand sliding around the nape of her neck, his thumb resting against her racing pulse. "Go up to the corporate suite. There's a dress in the closet. It will fit. Be ready by 7. The dress was a weapon. Charlie stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the executive penthouse suite, staring at a woman she barely recognized. The gown was a deep, midnight blue silk that clung to her ribs before falling into a dangerous slit up the left thigh. It lacked the garish flash of typical mob wife attire. It was elegant, ruthless, and unmistakably expensive. Donegan hadn't just bought her a dress, he had bought her armor. She picked up her phone from the marble vanity. The screen lit up. "Missed call, David, Seattle Logistics." Her thumb hovered over the callback button. She could call him. She could explain that she was stuck in a meeting, that the resignation had hit a snag, but she was still interested. She could maintain the illusion that a normal life in a gray cubicle, far away from shipping manifests and bribes, was still an option. A sharp knock at the bedroom door shattered the thought. "Car is waiting," Trevon called out. Charlie locked her phone, dropped it into a small velvet clutch, and walked out. The Pierre Hotel was a chaotic symphony of wealth and hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light over hundreds of politicians, judges, and corporate titans, all drinking expensive champagne while pretending they didn't know how the city really functioned. Donahan navigated the crowded ballroom with terrifying ease. He wore a tailored black tuxedo that made him look sharper, deadlier. His hand rested firmly on the small of Charlie's back, a physical brand that communicated ownership to every set of eyes that lingered on them. And they did linger. Charlie felt the weight of their stares. She had spent 3 years operating in the shadows of Romero Logistics. Tonight, Donahan was dragging her into the spotlight. "Smile, Charlie," Donahan murmured, leaning in so his lips brushed her ear. "You look like you're walking to the gallows." "I'm walking into a room full of federal prosecutors while holding an encrypted phone that can access a $3 million slush fund," she muttered, taking a sip of the champagne a waiter had shoved into her hand. "Forgive me if I'm not radiant. You look breathtaking." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. She glanced at him, finding his amber eyes scanning the crowd, yet entirely focused on her presence. "There he is," Donegan said, his grip on her back tightening slightly. District Attorney Miller stood near the ice sculpture, looking flush and nervous. He was a balding man in his 50s who sweated too much for a room this heavily air-conditioned. As they approached, Miller's eyes darted around, looking for eavesdroppers. "Donegan," Miller said, his voice a tight, high-pitched whisper. "I heard about the port. Tell me we don't have a problem." "We don't have a problem, Richard," Donahan said smoothly, offering a firm, devastatingly calm handshake. "Just a minor logistical delay. Container 42 is temporarily inaccessible." Miller went pale. "Inaccessible?" "Donegan, the primary election is in 3 weeks. The media buys are scheduled for tomorrow. If that money isn't liquid—" "I said we don't have a problem," Donahan interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on Charlie's arm stand up. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in politeness. He turned slightly, bringing Charlie forward. My chief financial officer, Ms. Reyes, has authorized an immediate digital transfer to bridge the gap." Miller blinked, looking at Charlie as if seeing her for the first time. "A transfer? Is it clean?" "It's spotless," Charlie said. The lie slipped off her tongue with terrifying ease. She opened her velvet clutch and retrieved the encrypted phone. "It's coming from a holding company in the Caymans, masked as a foreign investment in your brother-in-law's real estate firm. The IRS won't even blink." She tapped a final sequence into the phone and pressed execute. "It's done," she said, sliding the phone away. Miller let out a long, ragged exhale, mopping his brow with a cocktail napkin. Good. Thank you, Ms. Reyes." "Enjoy the party, Richard." Donegan dismissed the man, turning Charlie away before the DA could say another word. As they walked toward the quieter edge of the ballroom, near the heavy velvet curtains masking the balcony doors, Charlie felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her clutch. She pulled her personal phone out. Incoming call, David, Seattle Logistics. She stared at the screen. The buzzing felt loud, intrusive. Donegan stopped. He looked down at the glowing screen in her hand. The relaxed, confident aura he had projected all night vanished. The muscle in his jaw feathered. He didn't snatch the phone. He didn't yell. He just looked at her, his amber eyes burning with a dark, suffocating intensity. "Answer it," Donahan said softly. Charlie looked from the phone to Donahan. The air between them felt thick, charged with the same electric danger as the locked office earlier that morning. "Tell him you're busy," Donahan challenged, stepping closer until the silk of her dress brushed against his tuxedo trousers. "Tell him you've decided to stay in New York. Tell him you just wired $3 million for a mob boss, and you liked the way it made you feel." Charlie's thumb hovered over the green accept button. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked into Donegan's eyes, saw the violence, the possession, the desperate, unyielding demand that she choose his world. Choose him. She didn't press green. Her thumb shifted, pressing the red button. The screen went black. Charlie dropped the phone back into her clutch. She looked up at Donahan, her chin raised, her cynicism warring with the dark, undeniable heat pooling in her stomach. "I don't mix business with pleasure, Donahan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Donegan stared at her for a long second. Then a slow, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He reached out, his hand sliding around the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the intricate updo of her hair. "Neither do I, Charlie," he murmured, right before he pulled her flush against his chest and walked her backward out of the ballroom and into the dark, empty shadows of the balcony. The heavy velvet curtains swallowed the light and sound of the ballroom the second they fell shut. Out on the balcony, the July air was a thick, suffocating wave of humidity, smelling of exhaust fumes and hot concrete. It didn't matter. The heat radiating off Donegan was worse. He backed her into the stone balustrade. The edge of the carved railing dug sharply into Charlie's lower back, a physical anchor in a moment that felt entirely untethered. Donegan didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. His hands moved from her neck to frame her jaw, and he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. There was no cinematic buildup, no soft preamble. It was a collision. His mouth was hard, demanding, tasting of expensive champagne and unfiltered adrenaline. Charlie gasped into the kiss, her hands coming up instinctively. She meant to push him away. She had spent 3 years pushing him away, building a fortress of spreadsheets and professional detachment to survive his orbit. But her fingers hit the lapels of his tuxedo and tightened into fists, pulling him closer instead. She kissed him back with all the repressed, cynical fury she had carried since the day she realized what Romero Logistics actually was. It was a punishing exchange. Teeth clashed, breaths hitched. Donahan's hand slid down her spine, gripping her hip through the thin silk of the midnight blue dress, pulling her flush against his rigid frame. He felt like iron and violence, entirely unyielding. When he finally broke the kiss, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaved against hers. The silence on the balcony was broken only by the distant, wailing siren of an ambulance navigating the city streets below. "You didn't answer the phone," he rasped, his voice ragged, stripped of its usual calculated control. "I told you," Charlie breathed, her lips stinging. "I don't mix business with pleasure." Donegan let out a low, dark sound that was half laugh, half growl. "You just crossed the line, Charlie. There is no going back to the cubicle after this. You understand that? You are in this. With me." She opened her eyes. The amber in his gaze was molten, predatory in the dim light of the city skyline. She knew exactly what she had just done. She had chosen the cage. But looking at him now, feeling the absolute, terrifying certainty of his focus on her, the cage felt a lot like a throne. Before she could form a reply, the heavy velvet curtains jerked open. A sharp triangle of yellow ballroom light spilled onto the balcony, hitting them like a physical blow. Charlie flinched, instinctively turning her face away, while Donegan smoothly stepped in front of her, shielding her from view with his body. His hand slipped beneath his tuxedo jacket, resting on the holster harnessed to his ribs. "Boss," a rough voice grated. Donegan's posture relaxed slightly, though the murderous tension in his shoulders remained. It was Trevon. The enforcer stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light. He didn't look at Charlie. He kept his eyes locked on Donegan's chin. "What?" Donegan snapped, the cold, aristocratic mobster sliding instantly back into place. "We need to leave, now." Trevon's tone brooked no argument. It was devoid of his usual deferential caution. Donegan didn't ask questions. He turned to Charlie, his hand wrapping around her wrist. "Walk slightly behind me. Keep your head down. Don't speak to anyone." They moved fast. The walk back through the ballroom was a blur of crystal and silk. Charlie kept her eyes fixed on the broad span of Donegan's shoulders. They bypassed the main elevators, Trevon leading them down a narrow service corridor smelling of bleach and old grease. They hit the loading dock just as a black armored SUV pulled up, its tires screeching against the wet pavement. The back door opened. Donegan shoved Charlie inside, climbing in right behind her. Trevon took the passenger seat. "Go," Donegan ordered. The driver slammed the accelerator, and the heavy vehicle lunged forward, throwing Charlie back into the leather seats. The transition from the intoxicating heat of the balcony to the freezing, sterile interior of the SUV gave Charlie whiplash. The adrenaline drained from her system, leaving behind a cold, sharp dread. She looked at Donegan. He was staring at Trevon's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Talk," Donegan commanded. Trevon twisted in his seat, dropping a thick manila folder onto the center console. "That HR guy from Seattle, the one Ms. Reyes had lunch with." Charlie's stomach plummeted. "David? What about him?" "His name isn't David," Trevon said, flatly. He flipped the folder open. Inside was a surveillance photograph, blown up and slightly grainy. It showed the man from the steakhouse, but he wasn't wearing a cheap gray suit. He was wearing a tactical vest with the letters FBI emblazoned across the chest, holding a battering ram outside a suburban door. "Special Agent David Miller," Trevon read from a secondary sheet. "Financial Crimes Division. He's been building a RICO case on the West Coast for 5 years. He was transferred to the New York field office 3 weeks ago." Charlie stopped breathing. The air in the SUV vanished. "He wasn't offering you a job, Charlie," Donegan said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the photograph. "He was offering you a wire. I didn't know," Charlie stammered, horror washing over her in icy waves. She replayed the 2-hour lunch in her head. Every question he asked, every sympathetic nod when she mentioned being overworked, the way he kept touching her hand, anchoring her attention while gently probing her about the corporate structure of Romero Logistics. It was a honey trap, and she had walked right into it because she was desperate for a way out. "I didn't tell him anything," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Donegan, I swear to God, we talked about supply chain management and standard accounting software. I didn't give him a single piece of actionable intelligence." Donegan finally turned his head. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the absence of anger in his eyes was somehow worse than rage. "I know you didn't," Donegan said quietly. "If you had, we wouldn't be having this conversation at the back of my car. We'd be having it in a basement." Charlie flinched. The blunt, brutal reality of his world slapped her across the face. For a moment on the balcony, she had felt like his equal. Now, staring at the photo of the federal agent who had nearly ruined her, she remembered exactly what Donegan Romero was. He was a man who put people in basements. "He flagged your cell phone," Trevon interjected, pulling Charlie's attention forward. "When you rejected his call at the gala, he pinged the location. They know you were at the Pierre. They know Miller was there. They're going to put the pieces together on the bribe." "No, they aren't," Charlie said, her analytical mind automatically seizing the problem, desperate to prove her worth, to prove her loyalty. The transfer was routed through 3 different sovereign jurisdictions. It's a digital ghost. A cell phone ping doesn't equal a wire fraud conviction. It gives them probable cause for a raid on the office, Trevon pointed out. Let them raid it, Donahan said smoothly. He leaned back against the leather seat, casually adjusting his cuffs. The secondary servers are wiped. Charlie initiated the purge protocol yesterday. Didn't you? Charlie swallowed hard. Yes, the DA's ledgers are gone from the physical building. Donegan looked at Trevon. We're clean. Let the feds waste their time. Where are we going? Charlie asked, realizing for the first time that the SUV wasn't heading toward her apartment in Brooklyn. They were speeding over the bridge, heading deep into the affluent, heavily gated enclaves of Long Island. You can't go home, Charlie, Donahan stated, looking out the rain-streaked window. If the FBI realizes you aren't going to flip, you stop being a cooperating witness and start being a primary target. They will pick you up on a conspiracy charge just to squeeze me. So I'm supposed to hide? Donegan turned back to her. The predatory warmth from the balcony returned, settling over his features like a heavy dark blanket. You're not hiding, he corrected softly. You're coming home with me. The gates to Donahan's estate were wrought iron and massive, flanked by high stone walls that looked entirely out of place in modern America. It was less a house and more a compound. As the SUV rolled up the winding gravel driveway, Charlie saw the silhouettes of men patrolling the perimeter. They carried rifles, not clipboards. The vehicle stopped in front of a sprawling, aggressively modern glass and slate house. It was beautiful, sterile, and cold. Trevon killed the engine. I'll coordinate with the warehouse crew for the port swap tomorrow night. Make sure the DOE finds what they're supposed to find. Keep your phone on, Donahan said. He opened his door and stepped out into the humid night. He didn't wait for a driver to open Charlie's door. He did it himself, extending a hand to her. Charlie looked at his hand. It was an olive branch, a shackle, and a lifeline all at once. She took it, letting him pull her out of the vehicle. Inside, the house was silent. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls adorned with stark, abstract art. It smelled of cedar and expensive, solitary quiet. It was the house of a man who didn't invite people in. Donegan led her into a cavernous living room. One entire wall was made of glass, overlooking the black expanse of the Long Island Sound. The water crashed violently against the rocks below, a restless, churning void. Drink? Donegan asked, dropping his keys onto a marble console table and shrugging off his tuxedo jacket. I need to sit down, Charlie whispered. She walked over to a massive charcoal gray sofa and sank into it. The adrenaline crash was absolute. Her legs felt hollow. She stared at the expensive Persian rug beneath her feet, her mind spinning wildly. 2 hours ago, she was trying to resign. Now she was an accessory to bribery, actively evading a federal agent, and sitting in the heavily armed compound of a Mafia boss. She heard the clink of crystal against glass. Donahan walked over, handing her a tumbler with 2 fingers of amber liquid. Drink it. It will stop the shaking. She took it. The whiskey burned like battery acid going down, but it hit her stomach with a heavy, grounding warmth. She took a deep breath, looking up at him. Donahan remained standing, leaning against a low bookshelf, watching her with that unblinking, clinical intensity. How long did you know? Charlie asked. Her voice was steady now. The panic had burned off, replaced by a cold, cynical anger. About David, Donegan didn't flinch. Trevin flagged him a week ago when you scheduled the lunch. Charlie's grip on the heavy crystal glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. You let me go to lunch with a federal agent? You let me sit there and talk to him? I had 3 men in the restaurant. If he had tried to arrest you, he wouldn't have made it to the sidewalk. That's not the point, she yelled, standing up. The sudden movement made her head spin, but the fury anchored her. You knew he was trying to trap me, and you didn't tell me. You used me as bait. I used you as a test, Donegan corrected, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register that commanded the massive room. He put his own glass down and closed the distance between them. I needed to know what you would do. You needed to know if I would betray you. I needed to know if you were weak, he countered, stopping inches from her. The FBI builds cases by finding the weakest link in the chain and applying pressure until it breaks. You came to my office this morning with a resignation letter. You were terrified. You wanted out. If I had warned you about the Fed, you would have just run faster. Charlie stared at him, appalled by the sheer, calculating ruthlessness of his logic. So you let me walk into a federal trap just to see if I'd accidentally hang myself? I let you walk in to see if you were smart enough to survive it, he said softly. He reached out, his hands grasping her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. And you did. You didn't give him a goddamn thing. You sat there for 2 hours, smiled at a man trying to put you in a cage, and you gave him nothing but corporate jargon. You protected the family. I protected myself, she spat, trying to twist out of his grip. He didn't let go. He pulled her closer. It's the same thing now, Charlie. Look at me. She refused, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his loosened bow tie. Look at me, he commanded, his thumb coming up to force her chin up. She met his amber eyes. They were burning with a terrifying, absolute conviction. You thought you were leaving today, Donegan said, his voice a gravelly whisper. You thought you could just hand me a piece of paper and walk back into the light. But the light is a lie, Charlie. The feds don't want to save you. They want to use you to get to me. And when they're done, they'll throw you in a cell right next to mine. Because of you, she said, a tear of pure frustration finally breaking free, sliding hot and fast down her cheek. Because you dragged me into this. Donegan's expression softened, just a fraction. He reached up, his thumb catching the tear, wiping it away with a startling gentleness. I didn't drag you, Charlie, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. I opened the door. You walked in. You saw the ledgers. You saw the blood. And you stayed. You liked the math. You liked the power. He leaned in closer until she could feel the heat of his skin. Admit it. Stop lying to yourself. You belong in the dark. You belong here, with me. Charlie's breath shuddered. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream that he was a monster and she was just an accountant. But the memory of the balcony, the taste of him, the dark thrill of outsmarting the Port Authority and paying off a district attorney in front of a ballroom of elites. It roared through her blood. He was right. The normal world was gone. The man from Seattle was a ghost, a trap. The only reality left was the man standing in front of her. Charlie lifted her hands. She didn't push him away. She gripped his vest, pulling him down, and kissed him. It was a surrender, absolute and final. Donegan groaned, a deep, guttural sound of triumph, his arms wrapping around her like a vice. He backed her up, moving blindly through the massive living room until her back hit the solid wood of the wall. "You're mine," he breathed against her mouth, a vow and a threat, binding them both in the dark. "I know," Charlie whispered, pulling him closer, closing her eyes as the last piece of her old life burned to ash. Morning arrived without permission, bleeding a cold gray light through the massive glass walls of the master bedroom. Charlie lay perfectly still. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She cataloged the sensations first. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, impossibly soft and heavy. The air smelled of rain, cedar, and the faint, metallic trace of Donegan's skin. She turned her head. The other side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. Charlie finally opened her eyes and sat up. The physical ache in her muscles was a blunt reminder of the night before, a violent, desperate collision that had shattered the last remaining wall between them. She wasn't just the accountant anymore. She had crossed the Rubicon. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood. She found one of Donahan's discarded dress shirts draped over a velvet armchair, slipped it on, and buttoned it halfway. It hung to her mid-thigh, a stark white contrast against the bruising on her collarbone. She walked out of the bedroom, following the low murmur of voices. The house was vast, an architectural marvel of polished stone and glass, but it felt like a bunker. She found Donegan and Trevon in the kitchen. It was an aggressively modern space, all black marble and stainless steel. Donegan was leaning against the island, wearing dark slacks and a tight black t-shirt that emphasized the lean, kinetic build of his shoulders. He was drinking espresso. A disassembled Sig Sauer 90mm lay on the counter next to his cup, a jarring still life of his domestic reality. Trevon stood opposite him, a phone pressed to his ear, his bruised face set in grim lines. Neither man noticed her immediately. Charlie leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The cynicism that usually defined her worldview was strangely quiet this morning. In its place was a cold, absolute clarity. She had chosen the cage, and now she had to defend it. "Charlie," Donegan said. He hadn't turned his head, but he sensed her. He set his espresso cup down. Trevon lowered his phone, glancing at her. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't look at her like a civilian who had wandered into the line of fire. He gave a short, respectful nod. "What is it?" Charlie asked, pushing off the doorframe and walking into the kitchen. Her voice was slightly raspy, lacking its usual corporate polish. "They hit the tower," Trevon answered. 10 minutes ago, FBI and federal marshals. They locked down the 42nd floor and served a warrant on the server room. Charlie's pulse spiked, a residual instinct from her years in the gray. She walked up to the marble island, placing her hands flat on the cold stone, right next to the scattered pieces of the handgun. "Did they bring Miller?" she asked. "Special Agent David Miller is leading the raid personally," Donegan confirmed, his amber eyes tracking her every movement. He looked entirely unfazed by the FBI storming his corporate headquarters. He looked fascinated by her. According to our eyes on the ground, he looked very confident walking into the lobby. Charlie let out a short, hollow laugh. "He thinks he has the Cayman transaction pinged to the physical servers in my office." "He does," Trevon grunted. "Or he did." "The purge protocol," Charlie murmured, her analytical mind spinning up to speed. "Did it finish?" I executed it remotely at 3 a.m. while you were asleep, Donahan said softly. He reached across the marble island, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. The intimate gesture, performed right in front of his lethal enforcer, was a blatant territorial claim. The physical drives in the tower are completely wiped. They are holding nothing but terabytes of corrupted junk code. They'll take the hardware anyway, Charlie said, leaning slightly into his touch. They'll try to run a deep forensic recovery. They won't find the DA's ledgers, but they might find fragmented ghosts of the shell companies. We need to flood the zone. Trevon frowned. Flood the zone? Charlie looked at the enforcer. They are looking for a needle. We don't hide the needle. We dump 1,000 fake needles on top of it. I need my laptop. I have a back door into the tertiary cloud servers. I can generate 12 dummy ledgers linking the shell companies to legitimate, high-profile offshore investments. Make it look like a standard tax evasion strategy for hedge funds, not a mafia money laundering operation. Trevon stared at her. You can fake all that before they clone the drives? I already built the architecture months ago as a failsafe, Charlie said, her tone flat, pragmatic. I just need to hit execute. It will bury Miller in white-collar litigation for a decade. He'll be so busy fighting corporate lawyers, he'll forget Romero Logistics exists. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the kitchen. Trevon looked from Charlie to Donahan. A slow, terrifying grin spread across the enforcer's scarred face. He let out a low chuckle, slipping his phone into his pocket. Boss, you were right. She's not a civilian. Donegan didn't smile. His expression was intensely serious, burning with a dark, consuming pride. He stepped around the island, closing the distance between him and Charlie. He didn't care about the FBI. He didn't care about the raid. He only cared about the woman standing in his kitchen, wearing his shirt, weaponizing her brilliance to protect his empire. Get her the laptop, Trevon, Donahan ordered, his eyes never leaving Charlie's. Right away, Trevon said, turning and walking out of the kitchen. Donahan reached out, gripping Charlie by the waist and pulling her flush against his chest. The cold marble pressed into her back. 12 dummy ledgers, he whispered, his lips grazing her jawline. You've been planning this for months. I told you, Charlie breathed, tilting her head to give him better access. I'm the lead auditor. I look at everything. I prepare for everything. Even me? He asked, his teeth scraping lightly against her neck. Especially you. The heavy rain that had threatened the city all day finally broke just after nightfall, washing the Long Island compound in a relentless, driving downpour. Inside Donegan's home office, a fortified room lined with soundproofed walls and glowing security monitors, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Charlie sat in the high-backed leather chair behind the desk, her fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard of her laptop. Lines of code and encrypted server logs reflected in the lenses of her blue light glasses. She was deep in the digital trenches, managing the fallout of the FBI raid. Donegan stood by the window, staring out into the black, rain-swept night. He was completely still, a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. The digital clock on the wall flipped to 11 p.m. The Department of Energy response team just breached the quarantine zone at the port, Charlie announced, not looking up from her screen. She had hacked into the Port Authority's closed-circuit feed an hour ago. A grainy, black-and-white video on her secondary monitor showed figures in heavy hazmat suits approaching Container 42. Donegan turned away from the window. He walked over to the desk, resting his hands on the back of her chair. He leaned over, his cheek brushing against her hair, watching the monitor. "Did the warehouse crew make the swap?" Donegan asked quietly. "Trevon confirmed it at dusk," Charlie replied. "The bearer bonds are sitting in a secondary safe house in Queens. Container 42 is now holding exactly what the manifest says. Medical MRI casings." They watched the screen in silence. The hazmat team moved methodically. They popped the heavy physical seals on the container doors. One of the figures stepped back, aiming a handheld Geiger counter at the gap. Charlie held her breath. If Trevon's crew had messed up the swap, if a single piece of irradiated material had been left behind, or if they had tripped the internal weight sensors, the DOE would lock down the entire port. It would be a catastrophic logistical failure. On the screen, the figure with the Geiger counter lowered the device. He turned to the other men and gave a thumbs up. The team moved in, pulling the heavy doors wide open. They stood there for a long time, staring into the dark interior of the container. Then Charlie's encrypted phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up, putting it on speaker. "Go ahead." "It's a bust!" Trevon's voice crackled through the speaker, layered with the heavy static of the rain. DOE lead just radioed the Port Authority. They found 0 radiological signatures, just a bunch of heavy medical equipment. They're classifying it as a clerical error by the original shipping agent. The quarantine is lifted. A slow, vicious smile curved Donegan's lips. He placed a kiss on the top of Charlie's head, a silent acknowledgement of her victory. "And the FBI?" Donegan asked the phone. "Agent Miller walked out of the tower 20 minutes ago," Trevon reported, the grim satisfaction evident even through the static. He looked like he swallowed glass. "They took the physical drives, but our inside guy at the bureau says Miller is already getting heat from the higher-ups. The dummy ledgers Ms. Reyes planted triggered a massive jurisdictional dispute with the SEC. The FBI's Organized Crime Division just lost control of the evidence. "Good work, Trevon," Donegan said. "Pay the warehouse crew double tonight. Tell them to stay out of sight for a week." "Understood, boss." The line clicked, dead. Charlie leaned back in the chair, pulling off her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the last 18 hours finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But underneath the fatigue was something else. A dark, thrumming hum of power. She had beaten them. She had outsmarted a federal task force, manipulated a government agency, and secured $30 million in untraceable wealth. Donegan walked around the desk. He didn't pull her out of the chair. Instead, he crouched down in front of her, placing his hands on her knees. He looked up at her, the amber in his eyes glowing with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "It's over," he said softly. "It's never over," Charlie corrected, her voice entirely cynical, entirely realistic. "Miller will find another angle. The DA will want his next payment. Someone else will try to take a piece of the board." "Let them," Donegan replied, unbothered. His hand slid up her thighs, entirely possessive. "They don't have you." Charlie looked down at the man who commanded an army of killers kneeling in front of her. 3 years ago, she had been terrified of his shadow. Yesterday, she had tried to run from it. Tonight, she realized she cast a shadow just as dark as his. "You burned my resignation letter," she whispered. I did, he agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her silk pants. Because you don't resign from this, you just get promoted. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black box. He didn't open it. He just placed it on the desk, right next to the keyboard that had just dismantled a federal case. I don't need an accountant anymore, Charlie, Donegan said, his voice dropping into that gravelly, intimate register that made her heart race. I need a partner. I need someone who sees the cage and decides to own the locks. Charlie stared at the black box. She didn't have to open it to know what it meant. It wasn't a proposal of domestic bliss. It was a corporate merger forged in blood, a promise of shared empires and mutually assured destruction. She looked from the box back to Donahan. The cold, calculating corporate analyst was dead. The woman who looked back at the Mafia boss was entirely awake, ruthless, and terrifyingly free. Charlie reached out, resting her hand over his. I'll need a new office, she said. Donegan's smile was predatory, devastating, and entirely hers. He stood up, pulling her out of the chair and into his arms. You can have the whole goddamn building. If you felt the tension in that locked room, hit the like button and let me know in the comments if you think Charlie should run or stay and claim her place. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss part 4, where the real consequences of Donegan's possessiveness unfold. Share this video with a fellow dark romance lover, and I'll see you in the next chapter of this Mafia drama.